and we assume that there must have been investors banging down the door, especially at the height of the dot-com bubble, when some of the dumbest ideas imaginable were being showered with cash. But at the time, the reaction among the money men to Google wasn't, hey, no brainer. Instead, it was, oy vey, not another search engine. One of the few early dissenting voices to this chorus of doubt was that of Vinod Khosla, a hugely successful venture capitalist, tech guru, and one of the co-founders of Sun Microsystems.
I met them, I loved them, said I'd love to work with them in some way. So I introduced them to Excite. He said, this is a wonderful search engine and a better approach.
To Khosla, the logic was simple. At the time, he was an investor in the search company Excite, and he figured that if Excite bought or licensed Google's search technology, it would give them an advantage against their bitter rival Yahoo, which seemed to be dominating every battle and vanquishing all of its opponents in the portal wars. If Excite wasn't going to be crushed by Yang and Philo's army, it would need some fresh artillery. As any military commander will tell you, the key to winning a war is striking the right alliances. Now, in the hopes of getting Excite to team up with Google, Khosla arranged a meeting for Excite's chief technologist, Graham Spencer, to meet with Larry and Sergey at this sushi restaurant.
It's a pretty large restaurant, but they have private rooms in the back, and so we walked into the back. The Google team was already there. It was a very low table. Everyone was sitting on the floor. We took off our shoes and sat down and started talking about search.
The Google boys arrived with high hopes of securing a lifeline for their project. They'd done a test to demonstrate how much better their search results were than Excite's. Now, firing up their laptops, they showed the results to Spencer.
Google's technology definitely seemed impressive, and they were showing us results that looked good. I was definitely intrigued.
Spencer went back and told Excite's CEO, George Bell, about Google's technology, and so did Khosla.
And there was a lot of resistance, and they'd always come back with a fairly rigid view that search was generic, we can do this, we are almost as good, it doesn't matter. And it wasn't the issue of price, because Google was very cheap then. They could have bought it for something like $1 million. It's worth $100 billion today.
Wait, let's rerun this. Excite could have bought Google for about $1 million? That's a pittance in Silicon Valley terms. The company had just walked away from what for them would have been the deal of a lifetime.
And sure, in hindsight, I'll put my hand up and say, I look dumb. But people didn't think you could make money from search, or people thought you could make some money from search. They certainly didn't think it was a mint. I mean, look, let's be honest, search is a mint. It's a mint.
But it wasn't just Excite that failed to see Google's full potential. Every search company in Silicon Valley turned them down flat.
So with increasing frustration, Larry and Sergey sought out a professor of theirs from Stanford who happened also to be a serial entrepreneur, a man named David Sheridan.
They were after, I think, a fairly modest amount of money in the sort of $1 million range, and I had made some money with this startup that had been bought by Cisco, and I was working with Andy Bechtolsheim, who is a well-known Silicon Valley investor.
So David called me up and told me I really had to meet these Google guys, and I drove up to his house. It was a beautiful, summer, sunny morning.
Larry and Sergey were desperate now. They believed they were onto something big, but the supposed experts in search, some of the hottest companies in Silicon Valley, didn't agree with them. If David Sheridan and Andy Bechtolsheim didn't see the potential of Google, it was probably time for the Google boys to get back to those PhDs.
Larry showed up first, and then Sergey showed up, and Andy roared up in his Porsche.
When I arrived at David's house, Larry and Sergey were already there, so they jumped right into giving me a demonstration.
We met this guy. He quickly, he took a quick look at our search engine. We chatted with him a little bit.
They ran him through a demo of here's Google, and we can type in this, and I'm feeling lucky, and all those sorts of elements.
And it was immediately clear that this was a very, very good idea.
I think Andy was sold very quickly on this.
In fact, I think this was the best idea I've seen in my entire life.
So he said, I don't want you guys to have to, take too low a valuation or to have to worry too much about these money things right now. Why don't I just write you a check?
So I rushed out to my car, pulled out my checkbook, and wrote them a check on the spot.
Came back with his checkbook, and he wrote us a check for $100,000.
to Google for $100,000. I think it was Sergey saying, we don't even have a bank account, and Andy saying, well, put it in there when you do.
I don't think I've ever written a check on the spot like this before. That was the only time in my life.
Let's think about this. How many people do you know who'd be willing to write a $100,000 check on the spot to a couple of mangy grad students? I mean, even for a guy like Andy Bechtolsheim, who is worth many millions of dollars, the whole thing seems slightly nuts. But that's the kind of thing that happens here in Silicon Valley. It's why they call the early investors angels. They're in the business of doling out little miracles.
Andy was clearly putting a lot of faith in them, not just to not go to Mexico with his money, but they left with an extra level of excitement, as I recall, that we can really do this.
Bechtolsheim's investment was followed by checks from a handful of other angels, totaling $1 million.
$1 million must have seemed like a lot of money to a couple of students subsisting mainly on fast food. But as Larry and Sergey would learn soon enough, $1 million was chicken feed in the boom era Silicon Valley.
This skinny Clark Kentish figure is L. John Doerr, arguably Silicon Valley's most famous and successful venture capitalist. Having bankrolled Sun, Compaq, Netscape, and Amazon.com, he's officially the man with the Midas touch. And so it was probably inevitable that Page and Brin would eventually wind up on Doerr's doorstep.
They were so convinced that search was so big, so important, was going to grow so much, that I asked, so how big? And Larry Page, completely serious, said, well, 10 billion. I said, 10 billion, surely, maybe a billion, and surely you mean the value of the company? He said, no, 10 billion in revenue. Then I did fall out of my chair. I was certain that these were very ambitious entrepreneurs with a powerful vision, but never did I believe that Google would get to 6 billion last year in revenue, 10 billion this year in revenue, and with no sign of that growth abating.
There were few things that floated John Doerr's boat more than outsized ambitions. And even back then, Page and Brin had ambitions that would make any mere mortal blush. They wanted to organize literally all of the information in the world, make it searchable and universally accessible. Whoa! And so, after picking himself up off the floor, Doerr agreed to write the boys a check for more than $12 million. And he was matched dollar for dollar by Sequoia's Mike Moritz. Both the VCs saw Google as an enormous opportunity, but both of them were also just a wee bit nervous.
We did feel that we had paid an enormous price to invest in the company, and there were some sharp inhalations of breath as we, I think probably both in our own ways, realized what we'd done.
In the early part of 1999, I got a call from John Doerr saying he wanted me to come on down to his offices. There was something he wanted to show me. I had no idea what he was talking about, but when John Doerr calls, you come. Doerr sat me down behind his desk and told me he'd made an investment in a new startup, a search engine no less. Then he turned to his computer, fired up his browser, and showed me a website that I'd never heard of before, Google.com. The difference was startling, as was Google's radical simplicity, and the results it spit out were remarkably on target. I turned to Doerr and I said, wow, that's impressive, but there aren't any ads on the site, or anything else for that matter. How's this thing ever going to make money? And Doerr replied, these guys are solving the single hardest problem on the internet, and if we can't figure out how to make money from that, we ought to get out of this business.
But sussing out how Google would become a profitable concern proved to be no easy thing. And as the passing days turned into passing months without a business model, the VCs grew queasier and queasier.
There was no means of sustenance for anyone associated with Google. There was no money changing hands. And the founders had to hire people. They had to pay the people. They had to buy equipment to house their service. And all of that required money.
Something like $500,000 was flying out of Google's door each month, which meant that $25 million in the bank wouldn't last for long. The obvious solution was to follow the likes of Yahoo and Excite and put banner ads on their site. But in one of their gutsiest and most far-sighted decisions, Page and Brin refused to follow the easy path. They simply couldn't stomach the idea of Google turning into just another cluttered portal.
Larry and Sergey and the other Googlers had a great allergic reaction to websites that were just plastered with banner ads and flashing gizmos and pop-ups and all sorts of other things that weren't of great benefit to the user. And they wanted to make sure that they left people with a great experience, but also with advertisements that made sense to people.
Page and Brin weren't against advertising per se. They just wanted it in a more user-friendly, webified form. But they couldn't think of what that would be. Time and money were running out, however, so in the most controversial move of their young company's life, they found the solution to their problem in true Silicon Valley style. They copied it from somebody else. That someone else was this man, Bill Gross. Based down in Los Angeles, Gross had no connection to Google. He ran a small company called Idealab, a self-styled incubator of innovative notions and the startups that hatched them. It was Gross who cracked the riddle of internet advertising and, in a roundabout way, provided Google with its salvation.
I go through life looking around at problems that I see and looking for ways to solve them, whether they're life problems like traffic or health problems or technology problems, but I always like to look at everything and say, how could this be better? And try especially to see if there's a way that I can use technology to solve that.
Over the course of his career, Gross has turned his hand to everything from robots to solar panels. But back in the late 1990s, his obsession was web advertising.
When I saw this particular problem at this company, where our companies were looking for ways to advertise more effectively, and I was sort of saying to myself, how can we make this better? What's wrong with the way we're buying the advertising right now? What would we like it to be?
In hindsight, Gross's insight, like Page's count the links, was brilliantly simple. It started with the realization that when someone types in a search query, they're not just telling the world what they're interested in, they're often telling the world what they're interested in buying.
So if I type in the words Bob, Dylan, I'm saying at a minimum that I'm curious about him. Maybe I even want to buy his new album. Now take that information and all the other musicians' names I've ever typed into Google, and suddenly you have a detailed picture of me as a music fan, a picture of no small value for the music business. And this, in essence, is what Bill Gross saw, and saw before anyone else, that a search engine could be, and probably would be, the world's most powerful and efficient market research tool.
In tech jargon, the terms you type into a search engine are called keywords, and Gross realized that they could be worth a fortune.
Keywords are the future of the business. Keywords were so valuable because when a person types in a keyword to a search engine, they are giving you a huge window into the mind of their intent at that moment. You get them to type a few words, that's insanely valuable.
Gross believed that he could sell keywords to advertisers. BMW, for instance, would pay good money to ensure that every time someone typed the word car into a search engine, a link to the BMW site appeared up high in the search results. But even among Gross's own people, the idea of paying for placement seemed crass, objectionable.
And that was very distasteful to some people in this meeting. There were some people who were rolling their eyes at that idea. They're saying, no way you could get away with that. I said, come on, it's just like the Yellow Pages. Think about that. Think how useful Yellow Pages are. And I left the meeting and I ran back to my office and I grabbed the Yellow Pages. I brought it back in, I plopped it down, I opened it up. I said, look at this. Look how useful this is. You look for something in here. These are paid ads. And this is what the customer wants when they're searching for a plumber. Why wouldn't we do that in a search engine? Why wouldn't that be helpful? It turned out to be the big idea that search could be like Yellow Pages.
Gross ultimately persuaded the skeptics at his company, and in 1998, he launched a site based on keywords and sponsored links that would eventually be known as Overture. It was an instant success.
The CEO of the company came up to me and said, we are handling billions of microtransactions. We are bigger than the phone company even in the number of transactions we're handling. And that was really incredible. And then I realized, this really is a big thing.
What Gross didn't know was that back in Silicon Valley, his moves were being watched, and that Google would come to see his idea as the solution to its business model quandary.
Larry and Sergey happened on a little site that was growing quite nicely with sponsored listings called Overture. And Larry in particular, I think, felt that this offered a roadmap for what Google, for a business that Google might be able to get into.
The Google boys arranged to meet Bill Gross, and then to meet him again and again. Much of business history is determined by such meetings between aspiring titans meeting behind closed doors.
Well, I met Larry and Sergey, and we were talking to them about finding some way to blend the really great monetization that GoTo was having and the incredibly relevant search results that Google had. And we talked a number of times about different ways to incorporate those together.
Sometimes meetings like this end with both sides emerging arm in arm, but other times not. And that was the case with Google and Overture. What exactly transpired remains a bit of a mystery, but the outlines are clear enough. First, Larry and Sergey walked away from the talks without cutting any kind of deal. And then, shortly thereafter, Google released a service called AdWords that was uncannily similar to Overture's. Sound suspicious? You bet it does.
Gross sued Google over that similarity and the appropriation it suggested, but ultimately the two sides settled out of court. And one thing's sure, the settlement included enough money in Google stock to keep Bill Gross extremely happy.
We thought it would add value. We never thought it could have this kind of impact and reach and really make for such a valuable economic model online, but we're so thrilled that it has.